Hey everyone, and welcome to another MTG Top 10 list here on the Natsuko Magic channel. I'm Natsuko, as you probably know, and after the positive feedback on my first Top 10 list, I've decided to make this a weekly series instead of a monthly one as I'd originally planned. Um, these series work well as a weekly one because I don't take quite the time commitment as like testing decks and playing decks and things like that. I just, have to make a list and, think about things and do some research, but it's definitely less of a time commitment and I'm happy to do it every week. So I think I will be. This week, as you can tell, I'll be going over the top 10 zombies in Magic's history. Zombie is one of the more common creature types in all of Magic's history, and as of now, there are 341 different zombies to choose from. We're about to get more in Shadows over Innistrad. But I've narrowed this list down to the 10 best zombies in Magic's history. Some important sort of things to note are the criteria for this list is that the cards have to be creature cards. So things like Zombie Infestation, which obviously is a very strong card, don't make the list because it's not actually a creature card. Also, I've ranked these partly based on my own opinion about the power level and the usefulness and strength of these cards, but the rankings are also based on how much play a particular zombie sees or saw at some point in time, and I'll be talking about that as we go through the list. Now, you might be asking why I decided to go with a zombie list this week, and I will tell you. It's because this card was spoiled last weekend when they let out a bunch of spoilers to sort of give us a taste of what will be going on in Shadows over Innistrad. And this card is completely nuts, I think, and I think a very, very strong card. It's already pretty expensive to pre-order at like $20 or something, and you can see, it's a double black for a 2/2 with Menace. When it dies, you can return it to your hand by paying one black, and it has the additional ability, in this giant wall of text, of you can also just pay X when it dies to return another zombie card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and X is that converted mana cost of that card. So this card has a lot of utility. It refuses to die. It reminds me of some past zombies that we'll talk about, and I think probably this card is strong enough that it will probably, in due time, deserve to be on this list because it's just that strong. Before we get into the list itself, I will do a couple of honorable mentions, which are Withered Wretch and Phyrexian Crusader. They're both cards that saw play and a fair amount of play in specific formats at certain times, but they were never like incredibly powerful cards. Well, that's not true. Phyrexian Crusader actually was incredibly powerful in a block constructed deck in Mirrodin, not the original Mirrodin block, but Scars of Mirrodin block. And there it was, there was a mono black infect deck that it was very good in, and it, did a lot of work in that deck, but it never really saw a whole lot of play outside of block, although it was one of the key cards in that deck. But it does see some fringe play in some modern decks because it has protection from two of the colors with the best removal in the format. Can't die to Path to Exile, can't die to Lightning Bolt. And it's, also it's a good sideboard card, and you also see it in some fringe mono black infect decks. Because obviously, if you're doing mono black infect, you should have Phyrexian Crusader. Withered Wretch is a card that was printed a long time ago in Onslaught block, but it got time shifted. And once it got time shifted, it started showing up in a lot of decks' sideboards because it has some really efficient graveyard hate. It's very good against things like Snapcaster Mage or any reanimation strategies because you can wait for them to target the card and then exile it. It's ended up in at least the sideboards of most of the Birthing Pod decks. Birthing Pod got banned, so Withered Wretch sees a little less play. The other problem is that Relic of Progenitus also got printed, giving all colors access to a very good graveyard hate card. And Withered Wretch sort of faded it into not being important anymore. But I think it deserves to be mentioned because it was sort of almost a sideboard staple for a while, even if it's not anymore. All right, so now we will move to number 10 on this list, which is Carnophage. Doesn't look like much to us today. I mean, maybe it does, actually. We don't often see 1 mana 2/2s anymore, even now. You see 1 mana 2/1s, but 1 mana 2/2s you don't see much. And this does have a drawback, but when it was printed, it it was one of the most powerful and aggressive creatures that had ever been printed. One of the best one-drops that had ever been printed. You have to remember Savannah Lions was sort of the best one-drop that existed at the time, which was 1 white mana for a 2/1. Red had a 1 mana 2/1, but it had an even bigger drawback than Carnophage in that whenever it was dealt damage, you lost that much life. That was Jackal Pup, if you're curious. But Carnophage, I think, is better than both of those cards. The additional toughness is relevant, keeps it alive against certain removal. And the fact, you can play this on turn 1 and just start beating down on your opponent. It made black aggro decks really possible, and they hadn't really been in huge existence before the printing of Carnophage, because black just hadn't received highly aggressive creatures, highly aggressive one-drops, before Carnophage sort of showed up on the scene. So it deserves to be mentioned because it was a big deal back when it was printed in Tempest, but also because it sort of set history in motion in a way of, giving black a sort of a more aggressive role than it had previously. The next card on our list is sort of similar to Carnophage, in that it also now, to us, doesn't look like a whole lot. Skuta is usually going to be a 4 mana 5/5 that you pay 3 additional life for, which isn't awesome in a world where we have Siege Rhino, where we can pay 4 mana for a 4/5 with Trample, who actually gains us 3 life and drains our opponent. But creatures did not used to be nearly as efficient as they are now. That's why Carnophage was so good when it was printed, and that's why Phyrexian Skuta was so good when it was printed. In the time, it was almost sort of its own Siege Rhino, because it was the best thing you could do creature-wise for 4 mana in the time that it came out, just like Siege Rhino has been lately, in Standard anyway. And Phyrexian Skuta saw a lot of play in Standard. It was a great thing to do on turn 4, give you a huge creature that wasn't especially easy to deal with. And so Phyrexian Skuta deserves to be number 9 on our list. Number 8 on our list is also a card that was actually printed a long time ago, all the way back in Onslaught, Natsuko Husk. But it's been reprinted several times since then, and its biggest successes, I think, have been in the recent history of Natsuko Husk, and in our standard that exists right now, that is about to change in a few weeks. But Natsuko Husk is a really key card right now in the Rally the Ancestors decks that are sort of one of the big tier 1 decks right now in Standard. Natsuko Husk allows that deck to pull off its combo much more easily. Basically, what you end up doing is you have Zulaport Cutthroat in play, who every time a creature dies, drains your opponent for 1 life. You have tons of creatures in play, tons of creatures that put additional creatures into play when they come into play, and that make Eldrazi signs or whatever. And you sacrifice them all to the Husk, draining your opponent. Then you rally, get them all back, and then you drain your opponent again. So it's a pretty easy way to kill your opponent quickly with the rally deck. And I don't think the rally deck would really exist without Natsuko Husk being in Standard right now. There's just not another good, efficient, for free sacrifice ability out there right now that Natsuko Husk provides. So I think it deserves to be number 8 on the list because of really what it's doing right this moment, unlike 9 and 10, which are what they did a long time ago. Number 7, we have Tidehollow Skulldug's deck when it was in Standard. And it still sees some fringe play in Modern. It has an efficient body coupled with the ability to take away your opponent's best card. Something we've seen recently with what's his name? His name just left me, but Thought-Knot Seer, that's it. Obviously, Thought-Knot Seer is better than this. It's better than, a lot of creatures in Magic's history. But it's sort of similar. In its time, it was a 2-mana 2/2 who lets you take away your opponent's best card. They did get it back if they could kill the Sculler, but oftentimes you just took their removal away, giving you a very efficient 2-mana 2/2 body, and, on top of, having some disruption for your opponent's strategies. At number 6, we have Putrid Leech. This was an incredibly good card back when it, had its day in Standard. Also see some fringe Modern play. You can see why it's so strong. It's a 2-mana 2/2, which is already that's all right. But on top of that, it can be a 2-mana 4/4 oftentimes if you're willing to pay 2 life. That means it's out of range of things like Lightning Bolt if you pay the 2 life to save it. And it also means it hits really hard, really early. And Putrid Leech is a very strong zombie, a zombie leech, in fact. So we will move on to number 5, which gives us Lotleth Troll, another black-green zombie. This one a zombie troll. It made some appearances, has made some appearances in Modern, and it was very good when it was in Standard. You can see why. It has a huge block of text. It's not that huge, but it's a lot of things that are very good. A 2-mana 2/1 who has trample, lets you discard a creature card to make it permanently larger with a +1/+1 counter, and it's hard to kill because it can regenerate. What's worse is this card could really be abused in decks that didn't care about throwing creature cards in the graveyard anyway. Where this saw the most play was in a deck called Dredgevine, which played cards like Vengevine, Gravecrawler, spoilers, that's going to show up on this list eventually. Cards that come from your graveyard into play or want to be in your graveyard because you want to dredge. And your Lava Troll just gets huger while helping out your graveyard, which is what you really want to be doing with that deck anyway. And that's where he can really be abused, and that's where he has really been abused. So Lava Troll, a very strong card that deserves to be on this list, I think at about number 5. At number 4, we have Grey Merchant of Asphodel, another card with fairly recent successes. It was from Theros block, as you can tell from the devotion mechanic. As a 5-mana 2/4, you're obviously not very excited about that, but this card could just win you the game after a game, where you've already done some damage to your opponent, and then you drop Grey Merchant and drain your opponent for 10. Even if it didn't win you the game, usually it made it so your opponent couldn't win the game anymore because you're suddenly so far ahead of them, and they're generally going to be so far behind you. This card is crazy because it was printed at common. I think the only other card that had devotion that was printed that's of like a comparable power level, comparable impact to the game was Master of Waves, and that thing was a rare, maybe even a mythic. I think just a rare though, but maybe it was a mythic if I'm not remembering correctly. And the Grey Merchant is common, which also means that it sees a lot of play in Pauper because, when this guy came out, people were like, he's nuts. We need to build a Pauper deck basically with Grey Merchant in mind, and it's basically, a mono black devotion Pauper deck. And it, can win the game easily with Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This card just really dominated the format when it existed. The mono black devotion deck was one of the stronger decks around at the time, and it was really because of Grey Merchant that it could even be there and compete with mono blue devotion, which had Master of Waves. All right, so now we move on to number 3, where we have Gor Elfs Messenger. I'm sure you thought this would probably appear on the list at some point, and if you did, you're right. This card just has so much value. It is incredibly strong. The one drawback about it is you do have to pay triple black for it, but that's why you play it in a mono black or a mostly black deck. You don't have a problem casting it on turn 3. It does enter the battlefield tapped, which is kind of a downside, but the tempo that you sort of lose there by him coming into play tapped is sort of repaid to you because he immediately drains your opponent for 2 life. On top of that, he has a 3/2 body, which is relatively efficient, but then he has Undying. So if your opponent uses removal on him, assuming it doesn't exile him somehow, he comes back into play, drains your opponent again, and he's a 4/3. So that's, it's really hard for an opponent to deal with this. Control decks really struggled with this card because it's so easy to get 2 for 1, and if you're a control deck, you don't want to be getting 2 for 1. People sideboarded removal that exiles stuff just because of the zombie deck that existed when this thing was in Standard. And that it was pretty much the best deck. The zombie deck in Standard, when Gor Elfs Messenger was around, was pretty much the best deck in Standard at the time. And you basically, it was one of the best decks, I should say at least. And you had to have a sideboard to deal with Gor Elfs Messenger. So he sort of warped the entire format around him in a way, and that means he was pretty good and definitely one of the best cards in the format at the time. He's never seen a huge amount of play in Modern, probably partly because of Path to Exile, but he does obviously see fringe play in basically any deck, any Modern deck that wants to run zombies. He's there because he's just that good. He gives a zombie deck reach in a way that usually zombies don't have because he can drain the opponent without you even having to attack, so he's just a great card. So at number 2, we have a card that was a running mate with Gor Elfs Messenger and one that I mentioned earlier, and that is Gravecrawler. You may have thought it might be number 1, but I have it here at number 2. This card is pretty bonkers. It's sort of an unassuming, 1-mana creature. It doesn't even look very scary in its art, but he is relentless. He refuses to die, basically. If you have him in a zombie deck, you can just keep casting him back from your graveyard for 1 black mana, which is a very, very nice cost. Kind of reminds me of the mythic that we talked about at the beginning of the video that was spoiled because it just refuses to die. And he saw play not only in the standard zombie deck that existed, but Gravecrawler broke into modern in a big way because he was also in the Vengevine deck, along with Lotleth Troll, another card we mentioned. You could discard Gravecrawler with Lotleth Troll, and then guess what? Because Lotleth Troll's a zombie, you could then just play your Gravecrawler from your graveyard, and you really haven't lost anything at all, except I guess you paid... No, you don't have to pay any mana, actually. So you just pay the 1 black mana to bring Gravecrawler back, so you don't lose anything at all. You get a bigger creature, and you have a 2/1 back from your graveyard. Also enables the Vengevine coming back from your graveyard, because the Vengevine needs 2 creatures to be played a turn. So, for the Vengevine to come back from the graveyard. And Gravecrawler helps make that happen very easily because you dredge them into your graveyard and so forth. So, Gravecrawler, very strong, very hard for opponents to deal with, and also has synergy with decks like graveyard synergies like the Dredgevine decks. So, at number 1, what we have is Gourmet Angler. You might be a little surprised to see this there. It's a common after all, right? So was Grey Merchant of Asphodel. But Gourmet Angler is pretty amazing. One way to know that it's really amazing is that it sees play in one of the most powerful formats in Magic and one of the better decks in the format, a Grixis deck that runs Gourmet Angler in Legacy. And Gourmet Angler shows up there because he's incredibly good. It turns out Delve is really broken when you can, easily fill your graveyard with cantrips and fetch lands and all sorts of things like that. And in Legacy, that can really be abused. He was also very good in Standard in his day, along with Tasigur the Golden Fang. Those two, were sort of running mates that showed up in a lot of the Abzan decks and in various other decks in the format. Unfortunately, when Reflector Mage was printed, it really weakened Gourmet Angler and Tasigur, so you don't see them as much now. But I think the fact that this card sees play in Legacy should be a pretty good indication of how strong of a zombie it is, even if it is just a zombie fish. I mean, it is a massive zombie fish, I guess. But I think it's the best zombie of all time in terms of power level because it can be played effectively in one of the most powerful formats in Magic, and not many other zombies can really say that. But Gourmet Angler can, and I guess Gravecrawler probably sees play in Legacy too, but Gourmet Angler sees a lot right now, and I think that's a good indication of how strong it was. So that's my top 10 list, along with a couple of honorable mentions. Let me know what you think of it. Are there any zombies you think I left out? Are there any you think I rate too highly? We'll talk about it in the comments. This list is partly my own opinion, so I am definitely open to criticism and thinking about other cards. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.